Hola todos. So recently I've noticed something. So I'm taking IB Spanish Year 1 right now, right? And I've taken Spanish 1, Spanish 2, and AP Spanish before. But I've noticed a lot of my classmates are memorizing where the accent marks go on words. Like, oh my god, like they're saying like como estás. Like you have to remember put the accent on the first O and the accent on the A and estás. And they're just like hurting their heads memorizing these accent marks. And I just want to tell you too, if you're doing that too, which I bet a lot of you guys are, stop doing that. There is a very simple rule guiding you to know where the accent marks are, and I'll teach it to you in like 10 minutes. So, Spanish has three types of accent marks. The most common one is the acute accent, the one going up. You can put it on a, e, I, o, u. And there's a diaresis, two dots on the u, and there's also the enya. In order to have a good grasp of these accent mark rules, you have to get the concept of stress. So, stress is basically in which syllable you put the emphasis on. So in a word with multiple syllables, there will be like one syllable that's like the most prominent that you put the most emphasis on. And in English, we have a lot of that. So for example, in the word example, I'm clearly emphasizing the syllable exam, the second syllable. And you have to know that in Spanish, very often, which syllable you put the stress on affects the word's meaning. So make sure you pronounce words properly with the correct stress. So, for example, hablo, which means I speak, versus habló, which means he spoke. Similarly, we have papa, which means potato in some regions, and papa, which means dad. So we have a few examples of this in English too, but definitely not as many. So we have like object, which is like a thing, versus object, which means to oppose. Conduct, which means behavior, versus conduct, which means to lead. You really have to keep the stress of the word, aka which syllable you put the most emphasis on in Spanish. You have to keep that in mind when you learn new words or when you're speaking. The one major function of accent marks is indicating the stress of a word. And there are also four minor rules that we'll go over later, and we'll also go over, take a look at the enya and the u with two dots. Okay, so here's the stress rule for words in Spanish. So in a word with more than one syllable, now one syllable words can still carry accent marks, but that is a different rule that I'll go over later. But in words with more than one syllable, by default, they follow this stress pattern. So if a word ends with a vowel, so a, e, I, o, u, s, or n, then the stress falls on the second to last syllable. So casa, because it ends with a vowel, the stress falls on second to last, and it does so. Casa, ensayo, peligros, imagen. Notice how in all of these words the stress fall on the second to last syllable because they end with a vowel s or n. But if a word ends with anything else, so any consonant that's not s or n, then the stress falls on the last syllable. Pared, hospital, reloj, feliz. So notice in all of these words, because they end with a consonant that's not S or N, the stress automatically falls on the last syllable. And now do beware that even though the Z sounds the same as S in Latin American Spanish, the stress rules still apply differently for both of them. Like in Latin American Spanish, it would say feliz, but because it's an underlying Z at the end, it would still follow the last syllable stress rule instead of the second to last syllable stress rule. So just keep that in mind. But there are many Spanish words that break those patterns. If it does break the pattern, then put an accent mark on the vowel of the syllable that's actually stressed. Lápiz ends with a Z, but the stress falls on the second to last instead of the last. So we put an accent mark on the syllable that's actually stressed, the la. Mexico ends with a vowel, so the stress should fall on the chi, but it doesn't. It falls on the me, so we put accent mark over the e. Índice, again, ends with a vowel. Stress should fall on the D second to last, but it doesn't. It falls on the third to last, so we put accent mark over the I. Avion ends with N, so stress should fall on the A, but it falls on the vion, so accent mark on the O. Útil ends with L, so the stress should fall on the til, not the U, but it falls on the U, so accent mark over the U. Okay, you might be asking why do we put the accent on the O and not the I here in avion? Well, we'll go over this in the next row. So here's some more example words just for good measure. Accent required: autobús, África, región, perdida, aprendí, árbol, según, francés. No accent: deseo, mochila, agente, puerta, igualdad, carcaj, enseñar, ajedrez. So you can see for all of these words, actually, they all end with the vowel N or S. But for none of them, the stress actually falls in the second to last syllable. So we have to put the accent on the syllable that's actually stressed. Except for árbol, which follows the consonant other than S or N stress pattern. It ends with L, so the stress should fall on the last syllable, vol, but it falls on the R, so we put the accent on the A. Now for these words, the first four, they all end with a vowel, and the stress does fall on the second to last, so no accent needed. And for these, it's any other consonant, and the stress falls on the last syllable as expected, so no accent required. Now, sometimes a word might have an accent in its singular form, but loses it in its plural form, or vice versa. They usually end with N. So we have joven to jóvenes, and then to andenes, and avión to aviones. Now, why this is notice how adding the ES affects the stress pattern. Okay, so because these words all end with N, if we want to make it plural, we have to add ES, which creates an extra syllable. So for joven, in the singular form, the stress pattern perfectly matches up, ends with N, and it does fall on the second to last. But once we make it plural, we add the ES to the end, which creates an extra syllable. Now suddenly it doesn't match up anymore. So we need the accent on the O. Now, similarly in and then, which means like a train platform, in a singular form, it breaks the stress rules. It ends with N, but the stress doesn't fall on the second to last, so we put the accent mark over the E. But once we make it plural, we make an extra syllable, and suddenly it does follow the pattern, so no accent mark needed anymore. Same thing for avión to aviones. So cool, now you know how to accentuate Spanish words like 90% of the time. Now I'm going to go over the 4 minor rules that covers the rest of the 10% of the time. So minor rule number 1, breaking up diphthongs. So diphthongs, triphthongs, they're basically like 2 or 3 vowel sounds being pronounced together in one syllable. Spanish has quite a few of them. You can see like aire, pausa, hacia, cuadro, fuego, fuimos. But what you notice is that all of these have either an I, a U, or Y in it. Same thing for triphthongs, which are kind of rare, but you can see all of them still either have a I, a U, a Y, or a combination of them. Again, as I said, they're pronounced in one syllable. So for example, let's take the word radio. It only has 2 syllables, ra, and then dio. The dio is all one syllable. Same thing for like viuda, like view is 1 syllable, da is another syllable. So the word only has 2 syllables. But sometimes we don't want to pronounce 2 vowels in the same syllable, but we want to split them up into 2 syllables. So we'll put the accent on the I or U to indicate this. Dia, 2 syllables, not dia. País, 2 syllables. Without the accent, it would be pais. We don't want it to be said like that. So país, accent on the I. Situa, 3 syllables. Without the accent, it will be situa, and we don't want it to be pronounced like that. We want it to be situa, 3 syllables, accent on the U. Raúl, 2 syllables, accent on the U. Without the accent, it will be Raúl. Now keep in mind that the UE and UI in ke, ki, ge, and gi are not diphthongs. That's just how you spell the K and G sounds before the E and I. So like in a word like sigi, the I has an accent because of stress rules, because it ends with a vowel and it doesn't have the stress on the second to last. So that's why I put the accent on the I and not because it's a diphthong. If we don't want to split the diphthong apart, but the syllable that has the diphthong has irregular stress, then we would put the accent mark on the A, E, or O. Triángulo. Después. Acción. Now for triángulo, some people do pronounce it like 4 syllables, like triángulo, but that's technically incorrect. So notice how, let's say for después, because it ends with the S, the stress should fall on the des, but it doesn't, it falls on the pues. So we put the accent on the E. We don't put it on the U because that would break it up into 3 syllables. It would be después instead, and we don't want it to sound like that. So accent mark on the E, después. Acción. Again, accent on the O because we still pronounce all this as one syllable, but it doesn't follow the stress rules. If we put it on the I, it will be acción, and we don't want it to sound like that. It's acción, just 2 syllables. So we have this handy flowchart here. So should we split up the diphthong? If yes, then we put the accent mark on the I or U. Mío, ataúd. If we don't want to split it up, then does the syllable follow regular stress patterns as we went over earlier? If they do, then you don't need an accent. Hacia, fuego, tiene. Let's look at tiene. Ends with vowel. Stress should fall on the second to last, and it does. Tiene. If it doesn't, then we put the accent mark on the A, E, or O in like diámetro. Después, comió. Let's take a look at comió. Ends with vowel, so stress should fall on the second to last, co, but it doesn't. It falls on the mio, so accent on the O. Comió. Now, there is also another minor rule that's differentiating between homophones or words that are pronounced the same but mean different things. There's a few of them in Spanish, so we would put an accent on them to prevent confusion. A common one that you might have learned is C accented, meaning yes, versus C without the accent, which means if. Now, there's no rule for these, you just have to memorize them. Some of the most common ones I'll list in the next page. And you don't have to worry about the last 4 because the 2010 updates to Spanish spelling, or 2010 patch notes for Spanish, I guess, they eliminated the accent forms for these words. So it's really just these. Más, which means more or most, versus más without the accent, which is an outdated word for but. Like tú with the accent meaning you, tú without meaning your. Now, some of these are pretty rare. For example, you don't see the accented form of de a lot. It's like the subjunctive form for dar, and you don't really see it that much, but still, just know these. It's not a lot. You just have to know these 8. Feel free to take a screenshot if you want to. So yeah, that's it for rule number 2. Now, minor rule number 3 are the interrogative pronouns. So when an interrogative word, so a word that asks a question, like in English, your what, your where, your who, your how, is used to ask a question, it always carries an accent mark. ¿Qué haces? What are you doing? There is an accent on the que because it's being used to ask a question. ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? Where is the library? Accent mark on the donde because it's being used to ask a question. And yeah, if a question word has multiple syllables, then you just put the accent on where the stress is. They don't carry accent marks when they're used as adverbs. So here are some examples like hago lo que hago. I do what I do. The que here isn't being used to ask a question. Like I'm just saying I do what I do. I'm just pointing out what I do. So no accent. La biblioteca es donde puede leer libros. The library is where you can read books. The donde here isn't being used to ask a question. I'm just using it to point out like the function of the library. So you don't need an accent mark on the donde here. Now here are some more examples just for good measure, like ¿Cómo te llamas? What's your name? Literally, how do you call yourself? Versus hazlo como lo hago yo. Do it like how I do it. So you can see here, the how is being used to ask a question, so you need the accent on it. Here, how is just being used to point out like how I'm doing it, so you don't need an accent. Okay, you don't have to worry about this. The N accent in form of qual is really rare. Now, ¿Cuándo llegará él? When will he arrive? The cuando here is being used to ask a question, so accent mark needed. Me caí cuando corrí. I fell when I ran. Now here, the cuando doesn't need an accent mark because I'm just using it to point out like when that thing happened. I'm not using it to ask a question. So yeah, you can take a look at these examples. If it's being used to ask a question, then accent mark needed. If it isn't being used to ask a question, then no accent mark needed. ¿Por qué lloras? Por and que, 2 separate words with the accent on the que means why. Porque without the accent and 1 word means because. So yeah, that's it for minor rule number 3. Now minor rule number 4, this is the last one. We can add the suffix mente to an adjective in Spanish to turn it into an adverb. So let's see in action. Lenta meaning slow, lentamente means slowly. Rara, rare, raramente, rarely. But the adjective keeps its accent mark if it has one, even though the stress in the resulting adverb technically falls in the men part of the mente. So here we can see like rápida meaning quick versus rápidamente. Now in rápidamente, the stress technically falls on the men, but rápida, the rápida part, keeps its accent mark because that's just how it is. Común, meaning common, versus comúnmente. Like in comúnmente, the stress technically falls on the men, but mun still keeps its accent mark because común has an accent mark. And that's it for the acute accent. Now we can take a look at the ñ. So the N with the tilde is called the ñ, and it's a different letter in Spanish. It makes it sound ñ. It's very similar to, but not exactly the same as an N with the English Y sound after it, like ñ. But to approximate it, pronouncing the N with a Y after it is fine. Yes, it makes a different sound. It's not manana, it's mañana. It's not Montana, it's montaña. It's not Nino, it's niño. So make sure to pronounce the ñ. ¿Cuántos años tienes means how old are you? But ¿cuántos años tienes without the ñ means something very different, and you probably don't want to say this one. Now we move on to the last one, the U with the diareses. So if we want to spell the K sound before E and I, we will write it as QUE and QUI because the C in the and the is not pronounced like a K. So like quedar, quince. If you spell with a C, it'll be like fedar and quince, and we don't want it to be pronounced like that. Now similarly, if we want to spell the G sound before E or I, we would write it as GUE and GUI because the G in G and G is pronounced like a J, not a G. Like sigue, gio. We can't spell it as SIGE because that would be sige. So we put a silent U here to indicate that it's sigue. But there are a few words where the diphthongs UE, we, and UI, we, do appear after the G. So we'll put the two dots over the U to show that the U here is not silent. Bilingüe, vergüenza, pingüino, linguístico. And also notice that the I here in gui has an accent because linguístico ends with a vowel, but the stress doesn't fall on the second to last syllable. It falls on the gui, so we need the accent on the I. But yeah, you will put the two dots over the U here to show that the U isn't silent. It's not bilingue or pinguino, it's bilingue and pinguino. Also note that QUE and QUI with the two dots don't exist in Spanish. We'll just write CUE and CUI instead. So cuestión, cuidado with a C. So yeah, that's all the rules. Let's practice. Determine if these words should have an accent mark or not based on its pronunciation. If it needs an accent mark, determine what type and which letter it should go on. Teléfono. Teléfono. Accent mark on the second E because it ends with a vowel, so the stress should fall on the fo, but it falls on the le, so accent mark on that syllable. Ordenador. Ordenador. No accent mark needed. It follows the stress rules, ends with R, and the stress should fall in the last syllable, and it does. Ordenador. So no accent mark. Comíamos. Comíamos. Accent mark on the I, because we want to split the I up into two different syllables. We don't want it to be said like comíamos, it's comíamos. Fútbol. Fútbol. Accent on the U because it ends with a non-S or N consonant and the stress doesn't fall on the last. Sartén. Sartén. Accent on the E. Antigüedad. Antigüedad. We need the two dots on the U to show that it's not antigüedad, it's antigüedad. Estrújula. Estrújula. Accent on the first U. Césped. Césped. Accent on the first E. Estúpido. Estúpido. Accent on the U. Familia. Familia. No accent required because the lia is one syllable, and because it ends with a vowel, the stress should fall on the second to last, and it does. Familia, no accent. Añadir. Añadir. We need the ñ here to show that it's not añadir, it's añadir. Last one. Oír. Oír. We need the accent on the I to break it up into two syllables. It's not oír, it's oír. So how did you do? If you got more than like 10 or 11 correct, then congrats, you're a pro at Spanish accent marks. Press the like button if this video helped you, leave a comment if you have any more questions, and share this video to help a friend out. Thanks for watching. Adios.